All right, I think we are live.
Okay.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is Our Path Forward. Our Path Forward is a weekly Facebook live show by Care Washington, and it gives viewers a behind the scenes look at the work that we do at Care Washington while inviting viewers to join with us in reimagining what our path forward looks like in this post-Trump, post-COVID, inshallah era. So today we are talking about community journalism and the shifting media landscape with Care Washington Executive Director Imran Siddiqui and with our special guest, South Seattle Emerald founder Marcus Green. Going to read brief little bios for both of you guys real quick. So Marcus grew up in South Seattle, where he experienced firsthand the impact of one-dimensional stories on marginalized communities. After an unfulfilling stint in the investment world during his 20s, Marcus returned to his community with a newfound purpose of telling stories with nuance, complexity, and multidimensionality, with the hope of advancing social change. This led him to become a writer and to found the South Seattle Emerald. He was named one of Seattle's most influential people by Seattle Magazine in 2016 and was awarded the 2020 Individual Human Rights Leader by the Seattle Human Rights Commission. And Imran Siddiqui is our executive director here at Care Washington. He's been an advocate and a prominent voice for justice in the American Muslim community. He's also been a leading voice in the age of social media. And I lost my place. He started campaigns such as the No Ban, No Wall campaign. And he's been a leading voice in many nationally and globally recognized social media campaigns. He's appeared in the media outlets across the world for his commentary and thoughts on a wide array of issues. So thank you both so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excited to have this conversation. Marcus, I kind of want to jump in just by hearing more about you and the work you do at South Seattle Emerald, but just a bit more about you.
Yeah. So, I grew up as you mentioned in my bio, I grew up in the South Seattle area, which at the time I was growing up here, it was one of the most diverse zip codes in the United States. I think it held 3 of the top 10 at the time. And so there's this vast amount of, racial, diversity. I think it was 67, different ethnicities, 90 something different languages spoken. And yet, growing up here, all you would mostly see on the news would be contained to crime or urban blight or, decay or, some sort of domestic squabble. And occasionally they throw in, high school basketball, but that would pretty much be it. And yet you had this, vast cornucopia of just, human beings. And as I say, South Seattle is a community of communities because, there are so many, and you really wouldn't hear, about, the ingenuity here and the creativity here and, just the warmth here and the, just the communal feeling, that was here and that was present. I rarely saw that reflected, in our media, at least not with any great regularity. And so, somebody who had always kind of been entrepreneurial and very much invested in storytelling and writing, after I came back from LA, I said, why don't I do, follow my passion? And that really was trying to tell the stories of our community and doing it in a way that is embedded here inside the community and wasn't just, somebody swooping in, parachuting in to, sort of be a lay anthropologist, if you will, and coming into to document without truly knowing, the context of that community and how to truly navigate that community and the nuances of that community. And so for us, I always say with the South Seattle Emerald, it's not that we're trying to constantly be pie in the sky and Pollyanna-ish and bury our head in the sand about bad things that happen. But what we are trying to do, as we say, that the opposite of tragedy isn't some extreme sugary sort of positivity that, you know, borders on absurdity, the opposite of tragedy is nuance and complexity and multidimensionality. And that's kind of what we try to bring. And so that's, you know, that's pretty much where, you know, where we stand at this point.
Thank you for that, Marcus. You've described your path into journalism as non-traditional. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, I spent some time in the investment world. I was working for hedge funds for a while, which you know, a quick definition is basically you're making rich people even richer by investing for them, essentially. You know, and that's something that you know, for a time period when I was living in LA, you know, it was a good, I mean, it was a good experience for that time, right? In the sense that it was, you had sort of everything that quote unquote the American dream is, where, you know, you're leasing the Maseratis and you know, going to the fancy places and all that other stuff, and yet all that glitters isn't gold. And so I sort of started to fall out of love, if you will, with that type of lifestyle where everything and everyone becomes a commodity. And, you know, you're it's determined that if you can't make money from somebody within 5 minutes, you need to leave a conversation. You know, and so for me, I really, I had wanted to major in journalism or English when I was, you know, going to college, and I was advised against because they, you know, I was told that those professions just with the intention to the intention to go into storytelling and writing and doing journalism. And I knew that I, you know, I didn't want to necessarily go back to the school to get another degree. And you know, I've kind of always been somewhat of, I've always appreciated autodidacts and folks who can, you know, sort of, you know, learn in non-traditional ways. And so I immediately went and emailed every journalist who I respected in the city and asked them if they could mentor me, because I really wanted to, to tell the stories of my community and do it though in a way, right, with, you know, techniques that I'd be respected as a journalist, so that people couldn't automatically dismiss anything that we did at the Emerald. And sure enough, several people got back to me and they said, yeah, I'll mentor you. And it happens that in our current society, a lot of people will allow you to write for free if you for them if you want to. And so you know, I wrote for everything and everyone that I could, and, you know, asked feedback, asked advice from, you know, my mentors, and, you know, they gave it to me unfiltered. And just it was just a constant you know, chipping away at my craft and trying to become the best writer, best journalist I could be, and just be 1% better every single day. And, you know, obviously I'm still, it's a job that you're always an apprentice at. I don't think you're ever a master. At least that's certainly the mentality that I have from sort of this non-traditional background, if you will, that I came to journalism with.
And did you work for Seattle Times for a bit?
Yeah, so during my, so I founded the Emerald in 2014.
Okay.
I left in 2018 to do a year-long stint at the Seattle Times, and then as their South County reporter, and then I came back to the Emerald.
That's right. Cool. I want to shift to talking a bit about community journalism and this idea of who gets to tell stories. I was reading, before our conversation right now, I was reading the South Seattle Emerald's mission statement, and I saw that you all like list out the reasons why you do this work. And one of the items really stuck out to me, and it said, we do this work because, quote, every community should have a conduit to speak truth to power. And I thought that was really powerful, and it just really jumped out to me. Can you talk about that? And also, like, what do we mean by community journalism? How is it different, maybe other journalism, and why is it so important?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for us, we've seen that there's so much media that is done about certain communities that is not by, is not for, and does not speak to community, right? And I, with us, we were just, I think I can represent a lot of folks in South Seattle area and beyond, and say we were just very tired of that. We were sort of tired of having your community and your day-to-day life interpreted by somebody who doesn't, belong to your community, but also doesn't understand that community. And I think, it's just a very human desire to be gotten, to be, to have people get you as a human being, as an individual, but also as a community. And for us, I think that's why, we're not trying to necessarily do the fast story, or we will rarely be breaking news, or you rarely see the story, a story that's done by multiple outlets will rarely be the first, because we want to tell the full story, right? We want to be cognizant of the voices who are speaking in the story. We want to be cognizant of the people and the sources, who we're quoting. And I think so often, news just becomes a churn and a business like any other, so that, people are just trying to get a story up as opposed to, the story. And,
right.
And so for us, we again realize that historically, there are several communities that continue to be marginalized in our society, and the press is just another institution of power, in many ways a perpetuation of power and a perpetuation of the status quo. And so, there's some people who say we give folks a voice, but I don't agree with that, in the sense that everybody has a voice. It's just that many people's voices have been muffled. And so that's why we say we want to amplify people's voices in the work that we do. And to me, I think that's what truly differentiates community journalism from a lot of others, is, that mission, and that is undergirded by, that value to truly amplify, people who are usually muffled.
Yeah, you're right. It's like it's always been this way, but it's worse nowadays because of the internet. But it's about quantity. It's like being first, be first, get the story out. And what happens is you lose nuance, you lose maybe, accuracy, you lose perspective. And it sounds like the word that comes to mind when I hear you talk about all this is like thoughtfulness and like intentionality, like
and consideration, right? And just realizing that there is a power dynamic between, a journalist and their subject, right? You literally control this person's, life in terms of how people are going to perceive them. And many times this is, with rare occasion, unless you're a politician or, some sort of newsmaker or business titan, for the most part, you're only ever going to, get one story that you're featured in, or one story you're quoted in as a regular quote unquote layperson. And so, there are a lot of times where maybe something you've said will have been taken out of context, maybe, or, the journalist didn't get things right. It's not as if they're going to go back and do an entire new story to paint you in a different light. And so it's, I think it's just being cognizant of the power differential every time you go into the story as well.
Imran, I want to get you in on this conversation. You and I were talking about the continued corporatization. I don't know if that's a word I'm using. Corporatization of news. And you were talking about, an example of this being Jeff Bezos acquiring the Washington Post. Can you talk more about why this is a concern to you? And what do you think the solution is to this, or maybe at least an alternative to this reality?
Yeah, I think we're seeing this in this age of super billionaires. We may even see trillionaires in our lifetime, and just the ability of folks to go out there and buy like a major publication like the Washington Post. And it's not going to necessarily creep in like, just fully through the door all at once, but you'll just see this through how headlines are positioned, or how stories are positioned. Maybe Amazon might be positioned in a little bit less of a villainous way or less exploitative in how they conduct their business practices or their wage gaps and things of that nature. So I think that's definitely concerning in terms of the direction in which the media is going, because it's going to lose that level of objectivity. I mean, unfortunately, when you're dealing with marginalized communities, that objectivity has always been something that we've been searching for. What has been how the Muslim community has been covered, or on the issue of violence towards the Black community, versus the police, or the Israel-Palestine situation as well. Like, that's always been somewhere where you didn't see that level of objectivity. But you also see creeping in terms of conglomerates. Like, you see the Sinclair Media, for example, buying up all these local news outlets, and they create this prepackaged formulaic way of presenting the news. And you go to a news station in Montana, they're going to use the same formula as they use in a place like Seattle. And you see this sort of playing out in terms of how they just package these little stories. A few weeks back, when there were these Palestine protests, where you see like a true movement on the ground, there was 3,000 people plus at the Palestine protests over there. There was no coverage by the media whatsoever. And then you see coverage of like a Bellevue pro-Israel protest with about 70 people over there, and they're basically giving this unfettered propaganda viewpoint of what's going on with that specific conflict. So it definitely raises concern in terms of like who gets to write the editorial line in terms of who is presenting news to you. It's always, during my time frame in the post 9/11 era, in working on behalf of the Muslim community, it's always been a concern, because we're just not getting that unfiltered view of what's happening in our communities.
Yeah. Thank you for that. When you were talking about billionaires and maybe someday, soon trillionaires, and then you start talking about Sinclair and all this, I think maybe a lot of people don't understand how news outlets get their money, and why it can be so hard for some outlets like South Seattle Emerald, Crosscut, small, even like Real Change and that sort of stuff, to stay in business and compete with the larger guys. Here in Seattle, we had a Seattle Globalist, which was a great Seattle-based online news publication, and it was really a platform for voices that you normally don't hear, younger voices. It was a way for students and people that were new to journalism to tell their stories and to write stories, and it was just had a really like broad, diverse perspective. Anyway, Seattle Globalist had to shut down because of funding, I believe. And I was wondering if, Marcus, if you could just kind of talk to us, and maybe Imran too, about the role that money plays in the world of journalism. And if you could describe for us like how publications in general, how publications get funded and how journalists get paid.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a capitalist society still, and so money is it still rules the day in the journalism industry as it does other industries. And I think that's why you have organizations like the Sinclairs of the world and various billionaires buying up several depressed assets in whether it was the Washington Post, whether it was the paper in Las Vegas that I think Sheldon Adelson purchased. In many ways, it's used as a tool, to essentially perpetuate power that they already have. And if it's the George Orwell line, right? I mean, if you can control what people read and think, and the things that you put in front of them, and you can control really pretty much what they're thinking about. And so, and it isn't as nefarious as sometimes is let's write some take down piece of this person. To me, and I've seen it several times, where it's the stories that don't get told, right? It's the things that don't get attention. It's the controversies that get dusted over, and many times there's, there are organizations who do want to, and news outlets who do want to cover those controversies and do want to cover those stories that nobody else does. And yet it's harder many times for them to get funding because they do challenge power, right? They do remind people who have been told they're powerless for so long that they aren't. And those organizations aren't normally going to necessarily be so attractive to folks who want to, give large scale donations, right? I mean, most of those people are fine with the status quo, right? I mean, majority of those folks are, I believe what I saw in terms of statistics is most billionaires are straight cisgendered white males, right? So they're not necessarily hanging out with folks of color or too many other communities outside of, their insular bubble. So they're not going to think something like the Globalist or the Emerald or what have you or the International Examiner or Real Change, is as important as a legacy publication or a publication that speaks to, quite frankly, just, majority affluent white audience. And and so, unfortunately, those are power perpetuates itself, and those are the organizations that usually can continue to get most of the money and most of the, most of the ad dollars.
That leads in perfectly to my next question, which is, for so long the newsroom was dominated by white men, and I think to a large extent this is still the case, especially when it comes to who holds the positions of power. And I know you and I talked a little bit about this, Marcus, but I was wondering if you could talk about what your experience was like in the newsroom in regards to who you saw, who held positions of power, and if you wanted to talk about how did that affect how you felt about your place in the newsroom in journalism.
Yeah, I will say I haven't been in a newsroom outside of the Emerald, another newsroom, I should say, outside of the Emerald for about 3 years now. So everything that I'm, that I've seen is, that sort of 2019 period and before. But I mean, I will say, obviously, as you said earlier, as you referenced earlier, I mean, majority of newsrooms are very white, very male, especially when you do look at positions of power. And I'm not necessarily even just talking about folks who are the executive editors or managing editors, but the people who own the paper, the people who own, the people who are responsible for sort of the editorial board and the official position of a paper on a certain subject. And, those, I will say that, there are certainly times when I was working for somebody else or another paper that those opinions and thoughts obviously didn't always confer with a lot of opinions and thoughts that folks of color or folks who were non-Christians, shall we say, had. And so I think, and there wasn't always a lot of gauging of the opinions of those people in terms of, okay, how should we maybe approach this subject, or how should we talk about this? I know that there are certainly newsrooms that are trying to take that into account and do better. And obviously there needs to be more of them.
Yeah. Like, it's a lot better than it used to be, of course, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. This is going to be a question for both of you guys. And you both have kind of already touched on this subject a bit about who has the power to tell stories. The people behind the camera, the people who write the stories, the people especially who sit on the editorial boards, they have immense power. They're the storytellers who decide what stories get to be told and how they're going to be told. There is this myth out there, at least when I went to journalism school, there was this myth that journalism is somehow bias-free or can be free of bias, and that it's just facts, right? Which is, of course, it's an impossible thing to achieve. I feel like this idea hides the human biases and the personal lenses that we all bring to things, including journalists. I wanted to know if you could both talk about this idea of the storyteller versus the subject, and how there are major blind spots in mainstream journalism when it comes to who gets to tell stories and what stories get to be told. So kind of big and broad, wherever you just want to take that.
Yeah, I'll let Imran go since I definitely talked quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk from a care perspective, just like, you know, coming up in Arizona and dealing with this sort of post 9/11 era, just the constant struggle that we have as a community to tell our stories. You know, obviously, like with the type of subject matter that we've dealt with in this era, with, you know, rise in hate crimes and sort of just this global war on terror and, you know, the criminalization of the Muslim community over the course of these years, there's also been a lot of positive stories that have come out of our community as well, which were all essentially being obscured during this time. And that's a constant struggle that I had with local media, you know, in a place like Arizona, where there would be people doing amazing work, you know, like my wife also was running a nonprofit over there, like, you know, and they're giving, you know, tens of millions of dollars per year and in charity to like refugees who are, you know, being displaced all over the world and things like that are coming out of like, you know, our community that we also want to show you. But when these things come out, or the local refugee community being taken care of by, you know, the community as well, these things never make it to the media because there's always this sort of this need of urgency, especially like in this era of like clickbait, and, you know, you need to have like the most salacious or the most, you know, hottest headline out there, and it has to be associated with terrorism or through the lens of terrorism. Yeah. The constant struggle that the Muslim community has had to deal with. Like there's never been really a deeper look at those types of positive stories. So that's a constant struggle that we would have. Luckily, things are changing. Going back to your earlier comments about diversity in the newsroom, I think these changes are being brought upon by, like, you know, more people from the Latinx community, from the Black community, from Asian American communities being in these newsrooms and seeing that these viewpoints or this gaze is being very much formed by just white, you know, the white normative gaze essentially. So I think it's changing. I've seen some positive changes over the course of the past few years, but there's tons of work that still has to be done. I mean, that's why it's so important to have independent outlets like, you know, the South Seattle Emerald and many others, because this is where those initial stories end up coming out. In this age of social media, you have the ability for things to be more democratized. I mean, that's really how I've thrived during this age of social media, because very rarely am I tweeting out something from, you know, the Seattle Times or the New York Times or Washington Post. It's some hard-hitting journalism that's being done by somebody who's, you know, grinding away, who's free from these corporate biases that exist, and, you know, looking at our communities through a sympathetic or a human rights lens. And that's going to be a lot more valuable in this age of social media, where you don't have to have this corporate backing anymore. So I think as we get more, you know, of a flatter type structure within, you know, it's not flatter because of the corporatization, but I mean, there's just more ways that you can get the message out there. I think that's going to be very much more important. And then that will hopefully act as a pull for larger media to start jumping on these stories as well.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to give my thoughts real quick. That's one thing I love about the age that we're in social media, for all of its faults, and there are many, is that it used to be, you know, journalists and corporate news and all these, they care about what's newsworthy, right? They want to get eyeballs at the end. They want to get people's eyeballs onto their paper or station, whatever. So if something is blowing up on social media or something's really, you know, trending, that's newsworthy. Whether they wanted to cover that story before or not, they're probably not going to ignore it, because the bottom line is the bottom dollar, right? So I think that's just, to me, that's really empowering. When I started in journalism, it was just at the beginning of like Facebook and all this, and it's really just shaken up, I think, the industry. But Marcus, I would love to get your thoughts too on the power of who gets to tell the stories and whose stories get to be told.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think historically, right, journalism has, you know, a well-deserved reputation, quite frankly, marginalizing communities that that aren't white. And a lot of that is because I think we pretended for so long that quote unquote objectivity is really essentially has been really white male subjectivity that masquerades. And so I mean, there's I was reading quantum mechanics, or I think it was a study that was done in a magazine called Quantum Mechanics, and it talked about how there is no true there's a study done saying that there really is no true objectivity, because there are so many things and factors and sort of microscopic decisions that we are not even aware of that go on within our brain every day, and the fact that we are conditioned in different ways, right, depending on how you grew up, where you grew up. The fact that you need to find somebody else who is potentially better suited to tell a specific story, and also try to have a checklist, knowing that you're going to have knowledge gaps, and those are the things that I wish were implemented, quite frankly, just throughout the journalism industry, because I think it would make it a lot better.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marcus. I was talking with you guys before we started the live stream about this report that Care Washington did in 2016. It was a analysis of the Seattle Times coverage of Muslims, and it's a really great report. We'll actually put the link in the comments. I think it's carewa.org/Seattle Times. But basically, this report found, Seattle Times was using a lot of problematic language, stereotypes, portrayals about Muslims, like the words they used, what stories they were telling, etc. It's a really fascinating report, so we'll link that in the comments. But Imran, I know that you in Arizona, while you were executive director of CARE Arizona, that you worked with the media to try to push them and hold them accountable and challenge them on their stereotypes about the Muslim community. Can you talk a little bit about that work that you did and your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as somebody who came into this work a little bit later, like in 2011, 2012, I used a lot of the work that Care Washington was doing in terms of media accountability as a template in terms of what was possible for like an up and coming fledgling chapter at that time. So, props to Arsalan Bukhari and the rest of the team for putting together such like comprehensive studies as to this, because you would think this being a quote unquote progressive haven in Seattle, you would have a little bit more objectivity in terms of the journalism, but really behind the scenes a lot of it is hidden within the language and how things are portrayed, and how these little small projections that are put out there are harmful. Like, a key example in this linked report, you'll see that like you can refer to somebody who's like a terrorist, for example, like an ISIS terrorist, for example, as an Islamist, and you can put that in the headline. And then you can refer to somebody who is a nonviolent individual who's just religious as an Islamist as well. So now those two words are being transposed against one individual. So that report that Care Washington came out at the time is really calling into account these problematic terms that are being politicized intentionally by forces that are seeking to marginalize Muslim voices and the Muslim community at large, who are being paid tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to spread this type of message, and the media is sort of doing the work in doing that. So establishing those types of relationships with media outlets and building that trust, I think, is essential for our community organizations to help them understand. And so in places like Arizona, there were efforts that were made by outlets like Arizona Republic, who've had a horrible track record of, bias towards not only the Muslim community, but many minority communities, indigenous community, Black American community, Muslim community, Asian Americans, Latino community, and beyond. to have these talks about diversity and have people from the actual communities that you're covering speaking to your staff about, just like a open panel discussion, like where was this problematic? How do you feel like our coverage of this, of your community has been? And so that was like this started around 2015, 2016 timeframe. And I was able to attend a few of these and have these conversations with some of their staff, like staff reporters, editorial writers. And I'm like, as I said earlier, like all that I have seen is that you're portraying our community through this lens of extremism and terrorism. This is, during this sort of upswing in ISIS activity and things like that. And so why are you just calling on my community when you want some type of condemnation or some type of, how do you feel about this? Some examples of this, it's sort of absurd because, they would call our community and ask us, is the Muslim community, scared about, acts of retribution? And that's just sort of this ongoing narrative. Like if after a terrorist attack happened or something, I'm like, no, we're mourning the victims of the terrorist attack. Like, we're not, yes, there's always like a fear of like, hate crimes. That's not the normal thing, but they're trying to sort of just form this ongoing narrative, Muslim communities in fear and we're this or that or the other. So really trying to put us in a box. So having those conversations, I think, has been helpful. Also, building those relationships like with schools of journalism, for example. Like I was invited to the Cronkite School of Journalism a few times at ASU to speak to upcoming journalism students and just to talk about like, okay, you're going into this field, you should know some of these unconscious biases that exist in how you're covering minority communities, like namely the Muslim community. Like 1/3 of the Muslim community is Black American, but the way that it's being portrayed is that it's, entirely Arab or entirely South Asian or something along those lines. How come we're not getting any voices from the Black American Muslim community, for example? Why are we only, this is why these terms are problematic, or how, painting our community through the lens of terrorism is problematic. Try to look for beyond these stories and look a little bit deeper and build relationships with sources within that. So those brought some, some good traction, I think, within our relationships with these media outlets. And now you're starting to see like way more representation, I think, on the staff, of the local papers over there. So my hope is that it's going to continue to improve over the years. So those are just a few of the things that we've done.
Thank you for sharing that, Imran. It's language is so powerful, and with the word, I do think I think because of that report, I need to refresh my brain, but because of the report that we did on Seattle Times, I think they ended up scrubbing that word Islamist from their reporting vocabulary. And I was telling you this, Imran, but this was about over a decade ago, gosh, where I was working in a newsroom and I was writing a story that had to do with an undocumented immigrant. And I looked up the AP book. We have the AP guidebooks, like the Bible for journalists. It's like the rules about what language you do and don't use. And it was still using the word illegal it was like, this is the word you use. Like, this is the proper word. And I remember like arguing with my editor, like, I don't want to use this word. And he's like, it's AP style book,
Yeah, just because it's in the AP style book doesn't necessarily mean, coming from a place like Arizona where, the undocumented community is so prevalent over there, that's the language of dehumanization. And like, these are human beings who have the rights and the dignity to be treated like humans, like everybody else. So, really reevaluating the language that we use is important to humanizing folks that are being targeted.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a bit about, and this is also a question for both of you guys. I want to talk about how the media landscape is evolving and how recent social justice movements are challenging longstanding narratives that have been told by those in power. Specifically, I'm thinking about how the Black Lives Matter movement and the murder of George Floyd really started to shift people's views on, I should say non-Black people's views on policing in America. It's now pretty common to hear people reference systemic racism. 5 years ago, I felt like people didn't even know that term. A lot of people didn't know that term. I'm also thinking about how for the first time, at least that I can remember, I'm seeing more people, including politicians, celebrities, journalists, actually be critical of Israel and talk about what is being done to the Palestinian people. So there seems to be a shift happening. And of course, none of this would be happening without social media and without the internet. So in your opinions, both you guys, how is the media landscape evolving? And how have recent social justice movements like Black Lives Matter movement and the fight for Palestinian liberation, how have they shifted the way that the media is starting to cover some of these issues? And maybe Marcus, we'll start with you this time, then Imran.
Yeah, I think it's just made the media a lot more aware of how they cover issues, especially now that you have so many people who are media makers, and so many folks who are citizen journalists as well. Who, I mean, I think you saw that here with SHOP and the various marches and so forth and rallies and everything else that we had during that time period, when there were so many people who were, quite frankly, outdoing the BBCs and the New York Times and the Washington Post of the world, because they were actually here because they had actual on the ground relationships with people. You see that with Mari Salisbury, who's a journalist with Converge, and other folks who were here on the ground, and who were quote unquote independent journalists. And so I think because you have folks like that who who can be there as a point of comparison, it just makes the larger guys have to do better, right? Because you have this contrast, and so I think it if nothing else, it keeps the larger organizations honest about things, because they don't want to look foolish. So I think they those folks have provided a vital service to us as as a society.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think just for the work that we do, it's extremely essential. And just the fact that we're seeing like the masses get out there, whether it's protesting during the time of George Floyd and so many other countless acts of police violence, or any of these movements that are happening, like the massacre of Palestinians, in just these past few weeks, or the displacement that's taken place and the massive marches that were happening out here. When there's a shortfall that exists within mainstream media, then like these independent voices coming out are going to be like that, those voices that are showing the truth to the masses. And like I said earlier, this time of social media makes it that much more essential. You see, even the person who captured the George Floyd murder ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize. So even like the field of journalism is shifting in that matter. So you're seeing citizen journalism even being rewarded during this time because it's so important. So even for human rights issues like Palestine, like there was this plausible deniability that existed by mainstream outlets and in how they're covering these conflicts, because there wasn't really this level of documentation that existed in previous generations. But now that everybody's got a cell phone camera and can put it up on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever to show what's happening, you can't deny the images that you're seeing on the screen. Like these are straight up truthful representations. So I think that's changing the landscape as well. So the hope is that the mainstream outlets will continue to listen to the masses and sort of follow these movements.
Yeah, I agree. It's awesome. It's encouraging for me. This is a question I'm going to ask of you, Marcus. I'm going to start with a little bit of backstory on myself. So as a former journalist and TV producer, sometimes I feel a bit defensive on behalf of the media, because I feel like people talk about the media like it's this big, especially when Trump was in office. He would really just disparage the media, and I grew up conservative, so we were always talking about the liberal media and the mainstream media. And it's like people treat it like it's this monolith and like it's this, you know, this institution that's really only concerned with profit. And in my opinion, I don't think that's an accurate representation. You know, the media is made up of millions of journalists, and many of them care about challenging power and telling stories that need to be told. That's a lot of people become journalists. I would say most people become journalists because they care about telling stories. There's really not, it's not a lucrative industry for most people. So I wanted to know, in your opinion, Marcus, we've talked about some of the challenges and the things that need to be changed and the things that the news industry can do better. But I'm wondering if you can talk about what are some things that the news industry, in your opinion, is doing right, and maybe also what they can do better.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, as you said, it's not a monolith. So, no community is, including, the media community, I suppose. But I do think the thing that is being, the thing that gives me inspiration, I should say, is the fact that you do have so many, newer outlets who are coming to the fore, and you do have so many folks who are getting into the media landscape to sort of be their own, to provide that, media that has been missing. The people who really go, as they say, go to where the darkness is to bring light to it. And I think because it is less cost prohibitive to get into journalism now, in terms of if you're an individual or even a small group like the Emerald, I think you're seeing, a more vibrant media ecosystem, right? It isn't just, maybe the days are gone, right, where you had 3 print newspapers in a city, of course. Yeah, I mean, that's probably not ever coming back. But I think the days are here and are on the horizon, where you see, even a smaller city like Seattle, have multiple outlets. Everything in the pecking order from, the Seattle Times, the Crosscut, to the South Seattle Emerald, to the Stranger, to the Northwest Asian Weekly, to Converge, to Rainier Avenue Radio, to, you literally can go and Toronto News, to pick whatever you really can go to pick essentially whatever you wish, in terms of getting a decent front row view to what is going on in the community. And I think where media really suffers is when you have a monopoly, right? You have quote unquote a one newspaper town. I think where society and our local communities benefit is when you have, again, a very vibrant, dynamic media sphere. And I think that's what is giving me hope nowadays.
Yeah.
Just add to that real quick. One of the, as much as we, and I'm talking about like our community, like decrees, the media bias and so on and so forth. I always say that this is one of the most important professions that's out there for members of our community to get into. When I'm speaking to the younger generation, we talk to folks, about getting into, the legal field and to getting into public policy, but also getting into journalism as well. Like, if you're not happy with the way that you're being portrayed, like, help change the situation by, making our voices more diverse within the realm of the media. So for those youth that may watch this video, that's definitely something that we need from the Muslim community, is folks to pursue those journalism, backgrounds, and like going and working and telling the stories of our community. It's a noble profession.
Yeah, and I'll just add, for any, nice billionaires who might be watching this, I don't know if they are, journalism also needs funding. So if, Mackenzie, if you're out here watching it and you want to drop.
Oh, and that reminds me, we, so South Seattle Emerald is a community supported publication, and it does really, really important work, in my opinion. We're going to put the link to, if you want to become a monthly subscriber or make a donation to South Seattle Emerald, we'll put the link in our comments. You can check that out. Last question for both you guys and maybe we'll go, well, I don't care what order we go in, whoever calls dibs. Okay, what does the future of news and journalism look like? And what role do historically excluded communities have to play in it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it looks more diverse, right? I mean, I think it looks more of what I think it starts to match, what our, American society is starting to look like, which is more folks of color, more folks who are, come from marginalized communities. I think, that, I mean, the folks might not be going, into the more traditional paths of journalism, but I think you have more folks who make their own path, which is even more important. And so I think that's what the future of, journalism looks like. I think it's very similar to where the music industry was in maybe 2000, where, Tower Records was going out of business. And yet, right, I mean, and people were worried, or what's going to happen with music. It just, the delivery mechanism just changed, right? I mean, we get music, if we get it better, actually. I'm glad I don't necessarily, during the pandemic, have to go into a Tower Records. And so I think, we're nearing sort of that inflection point for us where I think there is going to be more of a transformation into, different ways and continue to be different ways in which we get information, and also by different people.
That's a great analogy with the music industry. I like that. I'm gonna remember that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it as well, in terms of the future depends on our communities to send folks who are, I come from like a South Asian background, and a lot of times, like, we would just like, oh, if your kid is smart, you would just channel them towards, being a doctor or an engineer. But if your kid is, doing well at like, English and like writing and like these types of classes, like accentuate those talents and like send them towards something that's going to be beneficial towards that. So that's number one. So having more representation within our community in these types of professions is extremely important. And there's always going to be a battle regardless. We've talked about the battles against corporate media. And then during the age of social media, there's also going to be battles against the social media companies as well for how they display content and their algorithms. So there's always going to be a battle for those who are trying to bring light to dark places and to tell the truth in society, to get that truth out. But the truth lies with the masses. We just have to continue to fight those battles and find those channels to get out there, and we're headed in the right direction, hopefully.
That is a perfect segue into promoting next week's Our Path Forward. So next week, July 8th, Thursday, 3 to 4 p.m., we are going to be talking about Block the Boat, Seattle, and updating folks on what's happening with Palestinian liberation. I'm so excited. We're talking with Palestinian member and Palestinian rights activist Miriam. So it's going to be a really good conversation. Definitely tune in for that. Marcus, Imran, thank you both so much. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. And yeah,
it was a pleasure. And well, I would say, stay cool, but thankfully things have cooled down on their own. So yeah.
Thankfully,
thank you so much.
Yeah. Take care.
All right, thanks guys.